On today's World Insight with Tianwei, the upcoming G7 summit in France, amid stark differences over trade, climate, and security, could they meet eye to eye? And the global ripple effects of simmering trade tensions between China and the U.S. How bad can they get? And here's our host, Tianwei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's show in the southern part of France, where the beach town Biarritz is on security lockdown starting Saturday to host this year's G7 summit. Before leaders from the 7 advanced economies arrived, divisions has already surfaced over Russia's membership, with U.S. President Donald Trump wanting to invite President Putin back to the table. Over the next 3 days, many say disagreements are expected also over trade, climate change, and global security. So, is any progress likely to be made this time? Before we get down to a discussion with panelists from different parts of the world, take a look at this first.
These 7 countries make up half of the world's nominal GDP. At this year's annual gathering of their leaders, the official theme is to combat global inequality. But the spotlight would likely be focused on the stark division between the American president and the rest of the group. In fact, as host, French President Emmanuel Macron said he did not expect a joint communiqué would be issued after this year's meeting, marking a first in the summit's history since 1975. Transatlantic trade rifts are a major source of tensions, while wounds over Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal have yet to be patched. The contrast between different styles of leadership will also be a point of interest at the event. Some are seen as champions of multilingualism and liberal ideas, while others with untraditional outspokenness rode to power on protectionist campaigns. Britain's new Prime Minister Boris Johnson had been called Britain's Trump, and his debut as Prime Minister on the world stage will be closely watched. As Brexit looms, Mr. Johnson faces the challenge of striking a balance between the EU and the US. G7 used to be a club of like-minded leaders. Amid the rifts and differences, has G7 outlived its usefulness?
So what can we expect from the G7 summit this weekend? Let's loop in our panelists. In Washington, D.C., Douglas Paul, a distinguished fellow from the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's a pleasure to see you, Mr. Paul. In Tokyo, we invited Katsuhisa Furukawa, a Japanese expert on national security affairs, former expert on the UNDPRK panel. In Paris, we are joined by Dr. Olivier Guillard, who is a research director at IRIS, which stands for the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Last but not least, in Beijing, Professor Zhang Gong from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. So, we understand, Dr. Guillard from France, that the possibility of communique is already scrapped off at this moment, as the French president, being the host of this year's G7, did not have that much high hope.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not exactly the best fantastic news that we would expect for such an interesting and important event. Once again, we discussed this issue earlier this morning with French officials, and we were considering that this is the 6th time that the G7 summit, formerly the G8, are organized in France, and this is probably the first time that we will have that we may have an uncomfortable end, not showing to the world the best image of a place where the most important leaders are able together and to communicate and to have a satisfying issue for everybody.
Mr. Paul, of course, people remember dearly of the last G7 summit, that interesting photo, which we all remember for months and even today, of U.S. President Donald Trump facing the other counterparts from the other G6 countries and regions. Yes, indeed, if we could put down that photo for now, it would be wonderful. But, you know, help us to understand, is this going to be as divided, if not more, than here, from your perspective?
I think it is. We've got actually a decline across the board of the quality of the people participating. We have an outgoing government in Italy, a new government led by a buffoon in England. We have an outgoing leader in Germany, and Trump and his own problems. The outstanding adult in the room will be Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, the host. But it's, by and large, this is a bad for any kind of good outcome.
Is it going to be U.S. versus the others, or this time it's going to be more mixed situations, Mr. Paul, briefly?
I think Trump does a good job of making everybody line up against him, even when they don't have a natural affinity among themselves. So I think this is likely to be the case. He has been trying to change the subject to getting the Russians back into the G8, and that itself will probably cause some divisions in the group.
If you look at Mr. Furukawa, the trade dispute that is happening among the G7 members, there is U.S. versus the EU, U.S. versus Japan on auto, U.S. versus Germany on auto. There's U.S. versus France on wine vis-a-vis digital tax. There is also various Germany as well on auto as well, and also Canada on iron and steel, and the list goes on. So do you think these will be minor issues compared to the bigger picture that the 7 so-called members of the G7 would love to achieve, or trade is already enough to divide?
Well, absolutely. The trade dispute is foremost concern for most of the Asian countries. In the coming months, we will be having a series of events that could pose a significant risks for the global economy, including the start of the American imposition of tariff on Chinese products. And probably next month, Iran says that they will start enriching uranium. And you are expecting the Brexit probably at the end of October, and WTO or dispute or resolution mechanism would become dysfunctional on December 10th, followed by another round of U.S. imposition of tariff on Chinese product on December 15th. There are so many problems, and the Asian countries such as South Korea is now seriously experiencing a serious slowdown of the economy. We are hoping to do our best to slow down and find a way to minimize the negative impact of those series of events on the global economic growth at the G7 summit.
Here is the thing, Professor Gong here in Beijing. There are issues that leaders have to handle, including with the economic growth rate, with trade, with climate change, and the list goes on. There are also bigger issues, such as what about the way of international governance? After all, G7 is a multilateral platform, which the United States president does not favor from day one when he's in the office. So what's likely to be the fate of G7? And if everybody wants to still have it function, what kind of roadmap could it still produce, if anything at all?
I think G7 is going to stay there. These people are still going to meet every year. But I think, you know, in terms
but
of...
But that's not the issue, isn't it?
That's right. In terms of a global governance, I think the more dangerous thing, previous guests has already mentioned, that's the WTO. In addition to the panel that makes decisions, the dispute resolution panel, there's actually a more dangerous, more important event. In a couple of weeks ago, the White House issued a sort of like ultimatum to the WTO, saying that within 90 days, 3 months, if there's nothing going to be done, the United States is going to treat, you know, those countries who self-identify as developing countries, they're going to do things very differently. So, you know, I think this is an open challenge to the WTO. It's not going through the due process.
But how is it linked to the G7, which is what we are talking about today?
Well, the thing is that I think, you know, you asked me about the global governance. I think there's a, you know, I think President Trump's attitude towards these international governance, global governance systems, is sort of just staying and also sort of a total neglect, I think.
This is the thing that we really want to discuss over here, Mr. Gillard. From your perspective, I mean, it's no secret that the U.S. president, as the president of the largest economy in the world, have always been favoring bilateral, in which U.S. can play divide and conquer for the best national interest. But now, G7 is a multilateral platform. So the question also is whether G7 will be of an entry point for Donald Trump to spread his ideology of making multilateral platforms not working, but rather focusing on bilateral and throwing away the so-called rule-based system, WTO included, and only focusing on the so-called different kinds of alternatives as we have seen over the past 2 or 3 years. So this probably is a fundamental question about the nature of G7 right now. Mr. Gillard, what do you think?
I must say that first that I'm not really a specialist on economic and major trade issues, more about economics and geopolitics. But still, the way the issue is discussed at the moment in this part of Europe, by the way, focusing on different orders, major issue regionally, we have the Brexit issue topics, we have the type of relationship that is moving from one stand to another with the United States. We need to take care about what's going on in different other governing countries. Yes. And the fact is that we're at the moment where we are having some kind of pretty discussions with our partners in Asia, in Africa, in Middle East, in Latin America as well, and others in Europe, where how do we, what is the best solution, the best option to try to strengthen the ideas of multilateralism and to discuss the fact that there is a place on this planet where there should be some kind of forums, informal or formal forums, where there are leverages to activate, to strengthen that kind of institute.
Right.
Unfortunately, I'm no longer sure that the G7 is the best, one of the best, one of the most successful forum to debate and to strengthen this very valuable issue.
It is important because some of the most important leaders of the largest economies are gathering over there. Therefore, let me go to you, Mr. Furukawa, as well about that question. Will this be a tug of war between what President Trump has been promoting, bilateral vis-a-vis multilateral, or will this be a point of start for other economies to correlate minus the United States? So what kind of example is this G7 likely to set for us this time?
Well, certainly President Trump has a very unique character, and he's not the easy person to persuade. But you should remember that if Mr. Trump wants to really negate the multilateralism, he would not have come to a G7 summit. But he's coming. And last year at the G7 summit in Canada, eventually Mr. Trump conceded that he would follow whatever Japanese Prime Minister Abe might coordinate with the other G7 summit leaders. Certainly the G7's economic power has been declining over the past decades, but nonetheless, G7 countries still possess around 46% of the global GDP share, and those countries still share broadly the similar value and the economic systems. Therefore, as you rightly point out, the U.S. government is currently pursuing strengthening more of its character of unilateralism when it comes to trade dispute, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. government can live on its own. So, you know, this is a difficult time, but we need to find a way to engage U.S. government.
How to engage? Of course, President Macron, Mr. Paul, has been having some grand plan if you look at his speeches over the past few days. But is there a hope that when you have a central idea, whether international system works, rule-based system works or not, in different leaders' minds, will they come to consensus on the way forward, Mr. Paul?
I doubt there is a basis for a consensus among these leaders. This is a really disparate group. The G7 historically has had its most importance when it's concerted the efforts of the various economies to deal with either inflation or a lack of growth. We are now seeing the warning signs of a recession coming. I doubt these leaders will be willing, one, to admit it, and two, to take collective action to I would look more closely at what's happening in Jackson Hole, Wyoming this weekend, where the world's central bankers are gathered, than to look to the leaders of the political systems of these 7 countries. Typically, G7 meetings are remembered best for what happened just before the meeting, and not in what's in the communique, not in what's decided, but for what they have to say about something that happened in, say, Lebanon or Zaire or somewhere else where a crisis emerges. The G7 lost its relevance really in 2008 when the G20 was formed as a source of real concerted economic action to deal with the global financial crisis at that time.
Let's talk about Wyoming, Mr. Paul, if you can, a bit. We understand central bankers and some of the regional banks heads are gathering over there, including the Fed chairman. Fed chairman is also likely to give a speech later your day today. So interest rate cuts, of course, he's not likely to make any grand announcement this time, but certainly he's going to provide some hints about it. Meanwhile, his position has been threatened, Mr. Paul, if we look at the reports recently about the White House trying to rotate governors of various bankers around the country to have this position as the Fed chairman. So a lot of things are going on, both politics and financially, as we see there could be financial currency and interest rates war. So what kind of context is that setting for this G7, Mr. Paul?
Well, overnight, the Chinese government announced its retaliatory tariffs on American products, and I think that will dominate the discussion in Wyoming, where the central bankers will try to find means of coordinating their policies to sustain growth in light of retreats on the trade front globally, but particularly between the United States and China. This is a kind of gloom and doom moment, and you look to the independence of the central bankers to be a source of rationality in managing the global economy. The actions you describe of the Trump administration to interfere with the independence of the Federal Reserve hopefully will not be successful. The independence is really vital to the maintenance of an intelligent economic policy.
Professor Gong, in the context and the backdrop, there is the danger of an escalation of tension of trade wars, not just one trade war between China and the United States, but trade wars between the United States and several other trading partners, including many of those at the G7. So here's the thing. Do you see there is a danger if this conference doesn't work well this time?
You mean the
coordination?
Yeah.
Yes, in G7, for example.
Oh, in G7.
Will there be currency war possibilities and dangers of wars of interest rates, which would be the ultimate most dangerous factors if you look at the trade?
Well, I think the topic of trade and trade war would definitely be raised at a G7 meeting, but I'm very skeptical that if President Trump will be persuaded by other world leaders. He is very opinionated and he is very adamant about.
But what about the other way around? Will he persuade the other leaders sitting there in the hall?
No, no way, no way. I mean, he's having a war with each one of them. He's having a war with Canada, with Germany, with France, and he's having a war with everybody. So I think at the G7, you know, trade will be raised, but these people will just agree to disagree, I guess. You know, they're not going to reach any kind of agreement. Now back to the Jackson Hole meeting. I think I still believe that I'm a little bit skeptical that the China issue, the trade war, will be a major topic at the Jackson Hole. It's mostly people are going to listen to Jerome Powell's speech about whether he's going to decrease interest rate. That's the major issue here. The market is prepared for this.
Yeah.
Is there any indication that he's going to do that? If not, you know, the market is going to tank. Otherwise, I think it's going to be okay.
Well, of course, the interest rates, some say, have something to do with what's going on between U.S. and China. Some might be using that as a weapon, some suspect, of the future realities. If you look at the U.S. president, many agree he is hardly seeing eye to eye with other G7 leaders on the summit agenda. Let's count the ways. Though French President Emmanuel Macron listed climate change as a big focus of the summit, to bear U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord at the Sicily G7 2 years ago. Mr. Macron has been trying to ease tensions in the Gulf region, the Persian Gulf, between Washington and Tehran, but it's hardly under any kinds of consideration by the U.S. Many European leaders are also, in fact, quite dissatisfied with the U.S. decision to pull out of the 1987 INF treaty with Russia. They are seriously concerned about their own potential trade war with the U.S. as well, with tariff threats on French wines and German cars. To top it all, no one knows whether President Trump signed this year's joint statement, if there is any joint statement. So, Mr. Paul, do you think there could be any progress even on specific issues like climate change? Maybe not use that word, but maybe U.S. take some actions leading up to the election. Maybe more about the trade discussions, leaders seeing one another and more on a cordial basis rather than a hostile basis. Any specific?
I'm not hopeful. I think on climate change, we tend to, the White House has worked to isolate itself and remove its ability to influence others. The U.S. will continue with dealing with climate change mostly at the state and local level, and that will be more effective than what's orchestrated by the White House at the national level, although there will be some damage done by the central administration. The U.S. doesn't have good ideas on these various subjects, and I don't think that they're likely to attract the support of the other parties there. Rather, they'll have disputes to air with each other rather than agreements to reveal.
Mr. Furukawa, of course, Japan was quite a host for the G20 summit, and eventually was even a statement put out by all parties. What an achievement by all. But this year's G7, is Japan as hopeful as when you were a few months ago?
Well, you know, as the U.S. presidential election campaign is nearing, it appears to me that President Trump is hardening his stance on specific issues. And I have to say that for the upcoming G7 summit, we should have a lowered expectation on specific topics. Our objective should be probably three priorities. One is to find a ways to minimize the negative impact on the global economy, stop the slowing down the global economic growth. And second, we need to find a ways to improve the WTO's dispute solution mechanism. But otherwise, WTO would become dysfunctional in the next 3 months. And third, we need to find a way to ease tensions on Iran. I know that all these issues are difficult, but coalition of the willings.
I see.
Even if U.S. may not be part of it, we have to engage U.S. on these issues.
Well, while we are discussing, there are latest news already coming in. The U.S. economy is in a favorable place, and the Federal Reserve will act as appropriate to keep the current economic expansion on track. Fed Chair Mr. Paul said that on Friday in remarks that give few clues about whether the central bank will cut interest rates or not at its next meeting or not. That is the latest news just coming in. Fed Chairman making the speech suggesting U.S. economy in a so-called favorable place, but did not give much hint as to whether the U.S. will continue to cut interest rates. I will continue to monitor what's going on in Wyoming when the news is happening over there. Let's come back to our discussion. Mr. Gillard, you've been listening to your colleagues earlier as the host country, France. How much can France, in a way, make efforts so that some pragmatic achievements can be done? Your thoughts?
I'm sorry, I think that my expertise is extremely limited on this issue, and I could not hear you properly, if you do not mind.
What efforts will France make? To what degree do you think can be achieved?
Okay, so if we look at from the French angle on this specific meeting and rendezvous, we must admit that most of the experts and observers have very low expectations about this summit, specifically maybe from the French perspective because it takes place in summer, because I mean the public opinion is looking pretty far away from what's going on in Biarritz, even if the place is quite nice with a touristic and very distinguished guest. But I can say that when the G7 summit takes place, it's supposed to be the highlight of the presidency of the country leading this the edition. But I'm not convinced at all that the French government has the very large expectations. When you specifically, if you receive this year political leaders who do have a kind of bilateral dispute, personal from several between them.
Yes.
I mean, I think about the American president and the British Prime Minister, who had recently quite unusual behavior with his counterpart here in Paris. The expectation must be really low. It's a political event, but it's not supposed to be a very historical event, whatever, according to us, with very minor achievement and a political dimension that should be probably very modest by the end.
Thank you very much, I guess I have to say, for that advice. Let's not expect too much. Actually, let's expect as little as possible so that you will not be disappointed for this year's G7. But for now, I want to thank the four guests helping us to see what's really going on over there. Douglas Paul, Katsuhisa Furukawa, as well as Olivia Gillard and Zhang Gong. Really appreciate, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. The global ripple effects of the simmering trade tensions between China and the U.S. With the recent tariffs coming out, how bad can they get? Some answers after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. The U.S. financial markets are flashing a warning sign of a recession, at least last week, and the global economy is weakening as the U.S.-China trade war drags on. In response to the U.S. latest additional 10% tariffs on $300 billion of Chinese goods, the Customs Tariff Commission of China's State Council announced recently the countermeasures. It plans to impose tariffs on over 5,000 products worth about $75 billion at rates of 5 to 10%. The measures will be in effect in two batches, one on September the 1st and the other December the 15th. Before we get down to our discussion about all the latest, take a look at this.
Buzz about an American recession is growing louder after Wall Street suffered its biggest day drop last week. According to the latest data released by IHS Markit, the U.S. Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index dropped to 49.9 in August, flashing a sign of contraction for the first time since September 2009. Any indicator that's below the neutral 50 threshold is considered a warning of contraction. On August 13th, the Trump administration delayed planned tariffs on China. The U.S. president earlier announced an additional 10% tariff on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. In a separate move, the U.S. Commerce Department accepted Chinese tech giant Huawei for another 90 days from the so-called entities list for national security reasons. Ran Chengfei, the founder and CEO of Huawei, said Tuesday he expected no relief from U.S. export curbs given the political climate in Washington, but expressed confidence in the company's bright future. On Friday, Huawei released its latest artificial intelligence chip, Ascend 910, and its matching open-source computing framework, MindSpore. The company says the new technology is part of its bid to expand into AI and semiconductors. While U.S. companies have long pleaded with the White House to stop the tit-for-tat tariff escalation, citing harm to consumers and their businesses, Mr. Trump has been undeterred. As the U.S. president counts on the economy to give him a second term in the White House, is the cost of the trade war hitting too close to home?
So what about the global impact and the latest developments of U.S.-China trade war? We are joined in Geneva, Liu Xianquan, who is the managing director of LADECO Geneva and also former senior trade diplomat of China to the WTO. In our Beijing studio, Zhang Gong, professor from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me go to you, Professor Gong. What about the latest tariffs China announced toward the United States? $75 billion U.S. dollars, 2 batches, one in September, one in December. What's likely to be the latest impact?
Well, first of all, I think this is clearly a tit-for-tat tactic. It's retaliation of the tariffs that are going to be imposed by President Trump on September the 1st. But also we have to keep in mind that even though the total figure is $75 billion of imports to China, but the Chinese government also said that companies can file for exemptions, and I would expect there will be a lot of exemptions being filed in the future. Another thing is that whether, keep in mind that they're going to talk. I mean, the delegation is going to meet again in early September. So, I think there's still
as the plan goes.
Right, if as the plan goes, yeah. So there might be still the prospect of, the December 15th tariffs hopefully will not be imposed at all.
We'll see. We're also joined right now by Anna Ashton, who's the director of the Business Advisory Services at the U.S.-China Business Council. It's wonderful to see you, Anna. What about your response to the latest development?
Well, I mean, it's hardly surprising. Every time that the United States has announced new tariffs on Chinese imports, China has announced new tariffs on U.S. imports to China. So, it's expected, unfortunately.
It's expected, and I guess we are used to it, even though the impact could be quite something. Mr. Liu, looking at what's going on right now between China and the United States, what do you make of it? It's a global economic impact. In fact, that's why the rest of the world is concerned about this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, many recent reports by international organizations are all pointing to a downturn development model. I mean, including some major economies in the world, including the U.S., Germany, China, and others. I mean, so we are seeing a glooming cloud gathering around. Of course, I mean, there's also some other still positive signals that the world economy could still benefit from some of the what I would call strong strengths, that some economies are still growing, employment are still high, wages are still starting to grow, so on and so forth. And the companies also have a nice cash flow. So I mean, both negative and positive signals are there. Of course, the kind of negative picture is looming larger.
Yeah.
The only thing we need to see is how the governments, the leaders, are going to respond to that, to turn the gloomy picture into a brighter one.
I guess that's the biggest uncertainty our world is facing right now, what the leaders are doing these days. Ms. Ashton, let me go to you. There are some signs. GDP-wise, U.S. is doing well still. But if you look at the manufacturing output, it's been down rather than going up, and also the jobs being created over the past few months, it's lower than expected, even though there are still quite a number over there. Meanwhile, American businesses have to consider move their operations to other parts of Asia rather than just in China, increasing the cost of business, that's for sure. What do you make of this mixed picture, given also the earlier stock market and bond market?
Well, I think that the mixed picture is the beginning of us truly seeing the negative impacts of the tariffs start to hit home. So, the Trump administration likes to talk about the fact that manufacturing jobs grew last year in 2018, but in 2019, that's not what we see happening. They're growing at a much, much slower rate. And, even when they were growing, the reality is that the way they were growing, with more steel and aluminum jobs saved or created in the United States, for instance, because of our 232 tariffs, those jobs cost American consumers and companies approximately $900,000 per job, which is 13 times more than the job actually pays. So they're growing at a great expense to Americans.
But Ms. Ashton, your President Trump, is now already very well known for using some mixed tactics as he sees it to boost up the economy. For example, talking to the Fed chairman and trying to cut so-called taxes of personal income, which has been scrapped off this suggestion over the past few days. Back and forth, these kind of things, drama going on. How do you read his mixed way of doing things? Is it more tactics or is it more, shall I say, politics?
Maybe it's a little bit of both. I think that, from my perspective, there's a desire in the Trump administration to stick to the approach to trade that they have initiated, which is, largely tariff-driven and dispute-driven. And there's a desire to try to stick out the negative impacts with the belief that somehow, after we sail through stormy seas, things will get better. And then in the meantime, asking that interest rates be reduced so that it's easier for American consumers to borrow money and spend money. But, we're looking at a global economy where 30 of the world's countries have reduced interest rates this year. That hasn't happened since the global financial crisis.
That's
so
right.
I think that the signs are all there that this approach is hurting us, not helping us.
Mr. Liu, since you're based in Geneva, help us to understand also your perspective. I mean, when Ms. Ashton using the word maybe the sky will clear up after the stormy sea, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? But the question is, whether the others will be able to bear the stormy weather during this process. Can they be prepared? If they're not, they're going to also drag the other biggest economies, China-U.S. included, down, isn't it, Mr. Liu?
Yeah, I think one thing is right. You have said, and Ashley has said that the China-U.S. bilateral conflict and the uncertainty it has brought forward will have serious impact on many beyond the two countries, and is global. And many, to be frank, are not prepared yet, simply because of this uncertainty. Nobody can predict what Trump would do. It has going doing this, and the next day that's the other thing. And then China has been always kind of hitting back, of course proportionately, but still a kind of escalation of the bilateral conflicts. So which brings a big kind of uncertainty for many people around the world. Here in Geneva, people are talking about that what is going to happen, and that's the question, and nobody could answer it. So I think that the mood is very low, and people are just waiting to see and praying for a kind of how to improvement of all the bilateral situation, and hoping that they could resolve their conflict. But nobody could promise anything.
What you used, a verb which is very impressive to me, praying for the improvement, if there is any, of the bilateral relations. Probably that is a reality that we are facing right now. Professor Gong, about China, also a crucial question. Though the Chinese economy is doing very well, still within 6% range GDP growth. But what China is relying on is a vast domestic market.
Right.
It's also relying on that there is still confidence in Chinese market all over the world. But will this be sustainable, Professor?
Well, I think if the global market is not doing well, it looks like which it looks like it's not going to do well. I think sooner or later it's going to come back to hurt us. Even though you look at the exports figures to countries other than the United States, we're still doing very well. We're doing well with ASEAN countries. We're doing well with European countries. But I think if the global economy is going to get a recession, we're not going to be immune to that. I think sooner or later it's going to hit back home. But I think, I think the good thing is that the Chinese government still have a lot of tools at hand. We have monetary tools, also fiscal tools. Not many countries in the world are afforded with this capability to still use the fiscal stimulus package, and we can still do that. So I think we have a little bit of a buffer room here.
Even though that is debated.
Even though it's debated, but I think when you know, when time comes, you know, if something we have to do, we have to do it. So I think jobs are very important here in China. You know, we pay a lot of attention to jobs, right. And you know, we can't afford to have a lot of people on the streets. So we, you know, if that moment comes, we just do it.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, almost every 10 years, unfortunately, knock the wood, there would be something so-called the financial crisis or economic crisis. 2008, also, and before that, 1999. And now we're also at a 10-year thing, if you look at that. Mm-hmm. And now we're facing also climbing of tensions at different fronts when it comes to trade relations. Would we be able to endure this stormy sea, in your words, Ms. Ashton? Finally, before we go.
You know, I wouldn't bet on it. I think that we ought to change our tactics now before it's too late.
Yeah.
Because we very much could end up in a wreck.
Okay, Mr. Liu.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, that this depends very much on how the major players respond to that with the right policy options. And there are many issues ahead that we need to resolve properly, including China-U.S. trade conflict, including the right. Brexit, including the ongoing Japan and Korea trade disputes, so on and so forth. Yeah.
That's a lot of demand for global leadership and global governance, what you're saying over there, Mr. Liu. And finally, before we go, Professor Gong, briefly.
Well, every economy will weather through these stormy waters every time. I think countries.
Well, in a better shape, or
I mean,
right?
the business. I mean, this is just business cycle. Economies are like that.
Okay.
You know, bad times do come, and we'll weather through this.
We have a philosopher in the room, obviously. For now, I want to thank the three of you for joining us, John Gong and Anna Ashton. Liu Xiangkun, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great weekend, no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. The weekend is up. Have a great one, everyone. Bye for now.